In the silent chambers of power across the West, a new realization is taking hold. The key to the future isn't held by oil sheiks or tech moguls, but by a handful of regulators in Ottawa. For decades, the global energy hierarchy seemed set in stone, but the map of power is being redrawn by a mineral most of us never think about. Canada's vast northern wilderness has become the front line in a struggle for energy survival that is currently shaking the foundations of the world's most advanced nations. As the era of cheap, unrestricted globalization fades into the past, uranium has emerged as the ultimate leverage in a high-stakes game of resource nationalism. The United States, Germany, and France are finding that their bold promises of a carbon-free future are hitting a wall built of radioactive rock and strategic sanctions. While the world focused on wind and solar, the backbone of Western industry remained quietly dependent on a supply chain that is now beginning to fracture. Canada's recent pivot toward a more assertive export policy isn't just about economics. It's a fundamental shift in the global balance of power that caught the world's giants off guard. This strategic tightening of the reins is forcing a desperate reevaluation of national security in capitals from Washington to Berlin. In the heart of the Athabasca Basin, the world's richest uranium deposits are being guarded with a new level of diplomatic intensity that signals the end of business as usual. Canada is no longer content to be a passive provider. It is now a decisive player that can dictate the terms of the West's industrial survival. American nuclear plants, which provide a fifth of the nation's electricity, are currently facing a supply-side crisis that few policymakers saw coming until it was too late. Without the steady flow of Canadian fuel, the massive cooling towers that power America's digital economy could soon become monuments to a lack of foresight. The relationship between Canada and its allies is being tested by a new reality where mineral sovereignty takes precedence over long-standing diplomatic traditions and trade agreements. It is a world where friendly neighbors can suddenly become the most formidable obstacles to national energy goals. France, the world's leader in nuclear dependence, is navigating a terrifying landscape as its traditional African suppliers fall into instability in the reach of rival powers. They turn to Canada as the ultimate safety net, only to find that the net is being woven with increasingly complex strings and conditions. Germany's situation is particularly ironic, as it tries to distance itself from nuclear power while remaining inextricably linked to a European grid that cannot survive without it. When Canada restricts the fuel that feeds France's reactors, the resulting energy shortages ripple across the German border with devastating economic force. We are witnessing the emergence of a new uranium curtain, where the ability to enrich and control fuel defines the next generation of global superpowers and economic winners. This isn't a temporary disruption. It is the beginning of a new world order where energy is the only true currency that matters. The technical complexity of uranium processing means that the West cannot simply buy its way out of this crisis with a few $1 billion and a new trade deal. It takes a decade to bring a new mine online and even longer to build the enrichment. Facilities required to turn raw Canadian ore into the fuel rods that keep a nation's heart beating. Canada is fully aware of this timeline, and by leveraging its massive 2026 mineral strategy, it is effectively putting a price tag on the West's future. The United States is currently scrambling to restart its own dead domestic industry, but the reality is that they are years behind the curve. For France, the stakes are nothing less than national identity, as their entire nuclear exception depends on a supply chain that is now subject to Canadian environmental and social mandates. As Ottawa prioritizes Indigenous land rights and new ecological standards, the traditional no-questions-asked flow of uranium has been replaced by a mountain of regulatory hurdles. This forced pivot is causing energy prices in Paris to surge, as the French government is forced to compete in a global market that is becoming more crowded every day. The sudden realization that their sovereignty is tied to Canadian provincial politics is a bitter pill for the French leadership to swallow. Germany is currently trapped in a self-inflicted energy paradox, having closed its own reactors while its industry remains completely dependent on the nuclear output of its neighbors. As Canada's export restrictions choke the fuel supply for European reactors, the Energiewende is being exposed as a plan without a solid foundation. The German manufacturing sector, the engine of Europe, is already feeling the slow constriction of rising power costs that can be traced directly back to the mines of Saskatchewan. This is a crippling effect that doesn't make headlines every day, but it is slowly draining the economic lifeblood of the continent's most powerful nation. This video is based on research and available sources. Its purpose is to provide information and does not intend to oppose any political position. The United States is now learning the hard way that its America First policies have a limit when it comes to the raw materials needed to keep the lights on in its major cities. For years, the U.S. allowed its domestic uranium production to wither away, assuming that the Canadian taps would always stay open as part of a shared North American interest. Now, as trade tensions rise and tariffs are threatened, Canada is showing that it can play the same game of leverage with its most vital resources. This lack of strategic depth has left the U.S. power grid in a vulnerable position where its carbon-free goals are now hostage to diplomatic negotiations with Ottawa. To understand the magnitude of this shift, you have to look at the sheer energy density of the material that Canada is currently restricting. A single pellet of uranium contains the energy equivalent of 3 barrels of oil. When Canada implements new export taxes or sanctions, it isn't just a minor trade dispute. It's the equivalent of a massive energy embargo on the most efficient fuel known to man. The 2026 data shows that uranium prices have surged past $100 per pound, reflecting a market that is terrified of a long-term supply deficit. Canada is sitting on the only high-grade solution to this deficit, and they are making it clear that access will come at a high political cost. The geopolitical ripple effects are reaching far beyond the Atlantic, as Australia and Kazakhstan watch this Canadian power play with intense interest and a desire to mimic its success. If Canada can successfully use its mineral wealth to extract concessions from the United States and Europe, it sets a precedent for a new era of global resource cartels. This could lead to a world where green energy is used as a weapon to enforce political compliance and redraw the maps of international influence. The era of the commodity superpower is no longer a theory. It is the lived reality of the global energy market in 2026. As the cost of nuclear fuel continues to rise, the dream of affordable, carbon-free energy for the masses is becoming a luxury that only the wealthiest nations can maintain. Governments in the West are being forced to choose between subsidizing the energy bills of their citizens or watching their industrial base migrate to regions with more stable power. This is the crippling effect that is currently hollowing out the middle class in countries that were once the world's leading economic engines. The power centers of the 20th century are finding that their 21st century ambitions are literally grounded in the frozen earth of northern Saskatchewan. What makes this situation so unpredictable is the internal political struggle within Canada itself, where the federal government and provincial leaders often have conflicting visions for their resources. While Ottawa might want to use uranium as a diplomatic tool in G7 meetings, provincial leaders in Saskatchewan are often more focused on local economic growth and jobs. This creates a fragmented and often confusing regulatory environment that makes it impossible for international utility companies to plan for the next 5 years. Consequently, the nuclear renaissance that many hoped would save the planet is currently being slowed down by a blizzard of red tape and local political infighting. Ultimately, the struggle for uranium is a struggle for the soul of Western civilization and its ability to remain a leader in a world that is moving toward a multipolar future. If the US, France, and Germany cannot find a way to secure a stable and long-term supply of fuel, their influence on the global stage will continue to fade into history. We are entering a decade where the definition of power is returning to its most literal form, the ability to generate electricity and heat for a nation. Canada has made its move on the global chessboard, and the rest of the world must now figure out how to respond before the lights go out for good.